Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
British companies employing more than 250 staff have just a few hours left to submit figures showing the average difference in pay for male and female employees. The deadline is midnight tonight. More than 9,000 companies have already published their data. It has revealed that 78% of businesses pay men more than women, 14% pay women more, and only 8% of companies have no pay gap at all. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson reports.
How much we earn. It's long been a stubborn problem between the sexes. But now, for the first time, our biggest employers have been forced to reveal the pay gap between their male and female workers. And the results aren't pretty. Now, this isn't about equal pay. Take Bobby and Laura here. They do the same job for the same pay. That's the law. The gender pay gap is the difference between average salaries of all men and women in a workforce, whatever their job or position. Here at the TSB, that gap is 24%, not as high as some other banks, but the boss says it's going to come down.
We have fewer women in senior roles, and this is the real issue for us. We need to focus on getting more women into senior roles across TSB. We think that's good for our business, we think it's good for our customers, and ultimately it's good for the UK economy.
Lunchtime in Croydon, a pit stop for workers. In every sector of our economy, men get paid more than women. The construction industry has a 25% gap, the biggest, followed by finance and insurance at 22%, industries where men dominate at the top. It's the same at Ryanair with its 72% gap. It says that's because most of its pilots are men. But in hotels and restaurants, there's just a 1% pay gap. That's because most staff are working for the same hourly rate. In fact, KFC, Starbucks and McDonald's say they don't have a pay gap at all, based on the middle earners.
It's interesting to know, but you always want to know what they're going to do about it.
I'm not surprised. Disappointed, but not surprised.
The problem is that we've not promoted women higher up the ranks where the big gaps arise, and until we do, we won't create equality throughout.
That's what they've managed to do at this technology services company. It's a record they're proud of.
We can't get away from the fact that women are still taking time off to raise their families, and often women have to come back on a part-time basis. Employers have to be cognizant of this and have to be much more flexible, I believe, in order to shift the dial.
It's not going to be easy or quick, but with the numbers laid bare, companies will now be under pressure to do better. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
Almost all of Britain's biggest companies, well, those employing 250 workers or more, have reported their gender pay gap ahead of tonight's deadline. Not surprisingly, it shows most pay men, on average, more than women. So will anything change? Well, our social affairs correspondent Emily Morgan has been looking at the figures.
There are few things that make you sit up and listen, but this might just be one of them. Of all the private companies who've revealed salary details, a staggering 78% pay men more than women. Most firms have now published their gender pay gap, and it's not very pretty. This London IT firm works tirelessly to avoid such pay disparities. They've closed their pay gap, but it's taken 10 years.
What really drives the change is changing people's mindset and actually having a cultural shift where it just becomes part of the organisation. In everything that you do, every decision point that managers make, they need to be conscious that this is an important part of who we are as a business. And until you get that cultural mind shift, it's not going to change.
The national gender pay gap is currently just over 18%. One of the worst culprits is Ryanair, who admits it's paying female employees nearly 72% less than its male staff. Fashion brand Karen Millen's reported paying men nearly 50% more per hour, and women working for banking giant HSBC also face a pay gap of 29%. Workers at FDM say this sort of information would affect their career choices.
Would you look at their data and
Yes.
see how big or small their gender pay gap is?
Yes, of course. As you do, you know, if you go and try to stay in a hotel for a week, you would look at the reviews, wouldn't you?
The fact is, once companies have published their data, there's no compulsion for them to make any changes. The gender pay gap could remain the same for years to come, since having a gap is not unlawful. The question is then, should there be penalties or greater incentives for businesses to do better?
I don't think there can be a stick to beat companies with just because they have an overall gender pay gap, because it's a very, very blunt instrument at the moment. I think what could happen is that the Equality and Human Rights Commission could go in and investigate companies where there is a particularly stark gap, and they could require them to make changes. Large companies will now have to publish their data every single year. If this percentage of firms still has a pay gap next year, tougher action may well be needed. Emily Morgan, ITV News.
Now, thousands of firms up and down the country are routinely paying their female staff, on average, less than men. Unsurprising, perhaps, but the sheer extent of the gender pay gap is now starkly revealed ahead of tonight's deadline for firms to declare their figures. From the results submitted so far, men across Britain are paid on average around 10% more than women, a burning injustice, according to Theresa May. Our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi reports.
Almost complete, the picture of Britain's gender equality looks divided. From banks to airlines, in the world of science to supermarkets, Britain's largest companies and charities have until midnight tonight to reveal their gender pay gap. And as it stands now, almost 80% of UK companies pay women, on average, less than men. When the government first launched gender pay gap reporting, it probably didn't realise the controversy it was about to unleash. But as the deadlines got nearer, scrutinies intensified. After a global backlash against harassment in the workplace, anger over the reasons why women are being held back has intensified. But in the centenary year of women gaining the vote, what more can gender pay gap disclosure actually achieve?
Well, these numbers can help us hold firms to account. They give us the transparency that mean there can be real scrutiny of employers and their part in the gender pay gap.
More than 9,500 companies have reported so far, and 4/5 of those companies pay men, on average, more than women, with a gender pay gap of around 12%. So for every £1 that a man makes, on average, a woman makes just 88 pence. Airlines, where 94% of high-earning pilots are men, and financial services are two of the worst-performing sectors. One investment banking boss that I spoke to said the criticism was unfair. At his company, just 20% of graduate applicants are women, but in the end, the bank hires 40% to make up the shortfall. He says the problem of attracting and retaining female talent only gets worse the higher up the ladder you go. One of the familiar issues is what's called the motherhood gap, when women take time out to have a family, but often at the cost of their careers. Some argue that this is a choice that women must be free to take, which is not reflected in the government stats.
I think that this data does a very poor job of reflecting what's actually happening in the workplace. It has not taken into account any of the key differentials like jobs, age, work experience, or time taken out of the workplace. So really, when you're comparing men and women with this data, the results are basically meaningless.
Should we just ditch the whole thing completely?
Yes, I absolutely think we should. I think it's created more problems than it's actually going to solve. Women still do very traditional roles. They do the majority of childcare and they do the majority of housework, and this is something I'd like to address.
Change?
Well, I think it depends on every individual.
If you think these numbers are meaningless, how are you going to measure if we're improving?
Well, you've decided that progress means a 0% gender pay gap, which is literally impossible to achieve. You would have to centrally plan the economy to the extent that I don't think Jeremy Corbyn could even dream up in his wildest dreams.
But for many, it doesn't need a puppet master state to introduce some workplace changes that tilt the current dynamic. Today's debate, the first step to shifting the old ways of thinking.
Well, from Edinburgh is Merryn Somerset-Webb, editor-in-chief of the financial magazine Money Week. And here in the studio, Sophie Walker, leader of the Women's Equality Party. Merryn Somerset-Webb, what does the gender pay gap tell us, and do you think it's being misunderstood?
Well, I do think it's being misunderstood. I mean, partly, people are beginning to equate a gender pay gap with equal pay, which is a very different thing. Of course, equal pay for equal work is very well established and a legal obligation. So we mustn't confuse that at all. What these numbers are telling us, well, to a large extent, they're not telling us very much, but they're telling us two things. The first is what has happened in the past, and this is very important. Remember that you can ask yourself, were women discriminated against in the workplace 30, 40 years ago? Well, yeah, of course they were, in many different ways. Are they now? Now, that's a different question altogether. But history means that today, the top of every company are people who are in their 50s and, say, in their early 60s. And these are people who rose to the top or began to rise to the top at a time where women weren't necessarily given the opportunities. Now, ask someone in their 20s or 30s today if they're given different opportunities to men, and I think you'd find that that is not the case. So It reflects history. It takes a while for this to work through, 20, 30 years, whatever. And the other thing these numbers reflect is choice. The choices that women have made about the careers they want to take on, the way they want to look after their children, the maternity leaves they want to take, and how they want to behave after those maternity leaves.
Sophie Walker.
Yes.
Which bits of that do you agree with?
None of it.
None of it.
Apart from the fact that Mary's quite right to say that people do get confused about pay discrimination and equal pay and pay gap. So this is a really useful exercise in explaining what the pay gap actually is. And what it's demonstrating is that this is not a generational overhang at all. This isn't something that we're all going to grow out of. Because if you look, for example, at Ryanair, they've got 72% pay gap. 8 of their 550-odd pilots are female. When EasyJet did a staff survey, they discovered that most of their male pilots decided by the age of 11 that they wanted to be pilots, while most of their female pilots had never even contemplated doing it at school. Now, that tells you that we've still got a problem with occupational segregation, so we're still teaching boys and girls the sort of pink and blue stereotypes about what work is they should do, and also what work is important. We do tend to pay more to jobs where men dominate. And second of all, we are learning to understand what this choice means. There's an idea that there's a lifestyle choice involved, or that women just choose not to do the difficult jobs or the shift work. Tesco's 12% pay gap is really interesting because they say this happens because men choose to do better paid shifts, so night shifts and bank holidays. Women find those shifts extremely difficult to do because on bank holidays you have to pay for childcare, which is the most expensive in the world, in the UK, and they don't want to do night shifts because there's an issue around safety, because we have a massive problem with violence against women in this country.
So does that pay gap mean that, the reason for that pay gap, mean that that pay gap is acceptable?
No, it means that we are starting to understand and unpick myths about choice.
So how do you solve that?
Well, you have to do the really hard structural work. So it's important that companies are forced to confront workplace sexism and bias. We at the Women's Equality Party think they should also be declaring pay inequalities by race, by ethnicity, by disability. We know, for example, that Pakistani and Bangladeshi women face a 26% average pay gap. But we have to do the hard structural work. Both the mainstream political parties, Labour and Conservative, have always dismissed investment in childcare as an equal economic infrastructure spending to, for example, construction. It yields twice the number of jobs, a higher tax revenue and lower in-work benefits. There is simply no excuse for government and other political parties to look at this figure today and say, this is all business's fault.
Mary Somerset-Webb, what do you think our next step should be then?
Well, I think it's quite nice that we're not blaming businesses here, blaming education. But, the next step here is happening already. Now, we know when we look at these numbers that the main thing that skews them is not what's happening in the middle and not what's happening in the bottom. In the main, it's what's happening at the very top. It's who gets to the top, how they get there, and how they choose to get there. But we also know that things have changed significantly. When I was 25 years old, flexible working wasn't a possibility. You couldn't work at home 3 days a week and go to the office 1 day a week or 2 days a week. None of these things were possible for the generation who are at the top at the moment. They are for the generation who are coming up now. So things are changing, and the way people will rise to the top have changed. And also, what we call the baby penalty, or whatever you like to call it, also begins to change. If we all work until we're 70, 75, whatever, a life and a career will have several different parts in it, and whether you've taken out 6 months or 5 years or 7 years or whatever to have a baby will make less difference to your career than it does now. But what I do think is really important is that we remember here that these are about choices for women. You know, I, for example, have chosen to work part-time so I can spend more time with my children because I am able to and because I would like to. And that is a choice that I would like to hear respected by other women.
Mary Somerset Webb and Sophie Walker, thank you both.